Mother Bear collapsed in front of the house. What this baby did put everyone in tears. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The last of the golden sunlight filtered through the towering pines, casting long shadows across the small wooden cottage nestled deep in the Montana wilderness. It was a quiet evening, just like any other, or so Thomas and Margaret Holden believed. After retiring from their decades-long life in the bustling city, they had chosen to settle in a remote corner of the world, far from the chaos, where the only sounds were the whisper of the wind through the trees and the occasional howl of a distant wolf. Inside, Margaret stirred a thick stew over the crackling fireplace, the comforting scent of rosemary and simmering meat filling the cozy home. Thomas sat on the porch, whittling a small wooden horse for their 2-year-old granddaughter, Sophie, who was playing near the window, her laughter bubbling through the evening air. Then, in an instant, the laughter stopped. Margaret noticed first the eerie silence. She turned to see Sophie standing motionless by the window, her tiny hands pressed against the glass. Her big, round eyes were wide with something Margaret couldn't quite place. Was it fear? Curious, Margaret walked over, her heart lurching at what she saw. A massive grizzly bear, its fur matted with dirt and ice, was lumbering weakly into their yard. Its movements were slow, staggered, as though every step was an unbearable burden. The great beast lifted its head, eyes clouded with exhaustion, and then, just feet from their porch, it collapsed with a thud that sent tremors through the wooden floor. "Thomas!" Margaret's voice was barely a whisper, yet filled with urgency. Thomas, hearing the distress in her tone, turned sharply, dropping his carving knife as his eyes landed on the bear. He stepped inside, bolting the door behind him. "Is it dead?" Margaret whispered. Thomas shook his head. "No, but it's dying." Margaret clutched Sophie tightly, feeling the child shift restlessly in her arms. "Bear!" Sophie said, pointing at the creature sprawled on their front step. Thomas cautiously approached the window. He had seen many bears in his lifetime, but never one in such a state. It wasn't just tired, it was suffering. Then, before they could react, Sophie wriggled free from Margaret's grasp and darted toward the door, her small fingers grasping the handle before either grandparent could stop her. "Sophie, no!" Margaret gasped. But it was too late. The door creaked open and the child toddled outside, her little boots crunching against the frosted ground. Thomas moved to grab her, but something made him pause. A deep, unspoken instinct, telling him to wait. Sophie, in all her innocence, walked right up to the collapsed bear. The great beast barely stirred, its breath labored, its fur rising and falling in slow, uneven heat. For a heartbeat, Margaret was sure this would be the worst moment of their lives. And then something incredible happened. Sophie reached out her tiny hand and placed it gently on the bear's massive head. The animal, so wild, so untamed, so close to death, let out a sound. A soft, low rumble. Not a growl, not a warning, a sigh. The kind of sound a weary traveler makes when they've finally found shelter. Tears pricked Margaret's eyes as she watched her granddaughter, a fragile little girl, standing in the presence of a beast that should have been terrifying. And yet, there was no fear between them, only understanding. Thomas, ever the practical man, swallowed hard and stepped onto the porch. The closer he got, the clearer the truth became. "Margaret," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "look at its side." Margaret stepped out, gasping as she saw the wound hidden beneath the thick fur. Dried blood crusted over a deep gash near the bear's ribs. The creature had been hurt, perhaps by another animal, or worse, a human trap. "Hurt," Sophie said, her voice quiet but sure. A single word, yet one that carried the weight of an entire story. For a long moment, Thomas and Margaret exchanged a glance. They had always believed in nature's course, in letting the wild remain wild. But tonight was different. This was a mother bear, likely separated from her cubs, wandering in desperation until she found their home. Margaret knelt beside Sophie, pulling her gently away as Thomas crouched near the bear. He didn't know if it would make it through the night, but he knew one thing. If this bear had come to them, it was because somewhere deep inside, it had trusted them. And that trust was something they could not betray. "Let's get some warm blankets," Thomas said softly. "And some of the leftover meat. We'll do what we can." Margaret hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Yes, we will." That night, under the warm glow of the porch light, as snowflakes danced through the cold air, the Holden family made a choice. To show kindness, to offer warmth to a creature that, against all odds, had chosen to place its faith in them. And as Sophie, wrapped in her grandmother's arms, watched the bear's heavy eyes finally close in exhausted relief, she whispered something in her soft, childlike voice. Something neither Thomas nor Margaret would ever forget. "Good bear!" And somehow, in that moment, they knew. They had done the right thing. Margaret Holden pressed her trembling fingers against her lips, her heart aching as she watched the mother bear's labored breathing slow. The great beast had given everything to reach them, had used the last reserves of her strength to deliver her child to safety. And now she was slipping away. Thomas Holden remained kneeling beside the bear, one hand resting lightly on her thick fur, the other cradling the frail cub wrapped in a soft blanket. The tiny creature whimpered, nestling instinctively against his chest, its body shivering from exhaustion and hunger. "Margaret," Thomas's voice cracked. He had always been a man of few words, but now words failed him entirely. How did one comfort a dying mother? How did one reassure her that her sacrifice had not been in vain? Margaret knelt beside him, her breath coming in uneven gasps. The mother bear's eyes, once so fierce, were now dulled by suffering, and yet they remained locked on her cub. The depth of her love was unmistakable, a connection that transcended language, species, or fear. Thomas hesitated, then did something that no sane man would ever dare. He reached out, his hand grazing the bear's massive paw, his fingers just barely brushing against her rough frozen pads. It was a gesture of respect, of gratitude. "You did good, Mama," he whispered. "You got your baby here. We'll take care of her. I swear it." A slow exhale left the bear's great chest. Her body shuddered once, then fell still. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, as if even the wind itself was mourning her passing. Margaret squeezed her eyes shut, pressing a shaking hand against her chest. She had spent years tending to orphaned animals, had nursed creatures back to health before. But this was something different. This was a mother's final act of love. A soft cry from the cub pulled Margaret back to the present. She opened her eyes and looked down at the fragile bundle in Thomas's arms. Its tiny, dark eyes blinked up at her, full of confusion and fear. It was searching for the warmth that had always been there, but was now gone forever. Lily, their little girl, wriggled out of Margaret's grip before she could stop her. She toddled over to Thomas, reaching out her chubby hands toward the cub. "Baby," she said again, her voice full of wonder and sadness. Cold. Thomas exchanged a glance with Margaret. He knew what she was thinking because he was thinking it too. This little one wouldn't survive the night without warmth, without nourishment, without a mother. A sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, rattling the trees, and with it came the distant sound of approaching vehicles. The vet. The rangers. Help was almost here. But Thomas wasn't sure if he trusted them with the cub. "We should bring her inside," Margaret said, voicing his thoughts before he could. "She won't last out here." Thomas nodded. Holding the cub close, he rose to his feet, casting one last glance at the mother bear. The guilt gnawed at his insides. Was this what she had wanted? Had she chosen them? Or had she simply collapsed by coincidence? He would never know. But what he did know was that he couldn't let her baby die, not after all she had done to save it. As they carried the cub inside, the warmth of the house engulfed them. The fire crackled invitingly, the smell of pine and home filling the space. Thomas carefully set the cub down on a thick bundle of blankets by the hearth, watching as it instinctively burrowed into the softness. Lily, still sniffling, knelt beside it, her small fingers brushing against its fur. "Bear baby," she whispered. Margaret moved quickly, heating up some milk on the stove and mixing it with a special formula she had once used to nurse abandoned fawns. She poured it into a small bottle, testing the temperature on her wrist before passing it to Thomas. "Try," she urged. Thomas took the bottle and carefully brought it to the cub's tiny mouth. For a moment, nothing happened. The cub simply lay there, unmoving, too weak to respond. Then, after what felt like an eternity, a tiny pink tongue flicked out, tasting the milk. A second later, the cub latched on, sucking weakly at first, then with more urgency. If you're still watching this story, drop a "own" in the comments to let us know you're here. Relief flooded through Thomas. He looked up at Margaret, who had tears running silently down her cheeks. "She's fighting," Margaret whispered, a small hopeful smile breaking through the sadness. "She wants to live." Lily clapped her hands softly, as if cheering the little one on. The sound of tires crunching on gravel reminded them that help had arrived. Margaret moved to the window, peering out as two trucks pulled up. A woman in a thick parka stepped out first. Dr. Reyes, the vet, followed closely by two park rangers. Thomas sighed, looking down at the cub nestled against him. "They're going to want to take her," he murmured. "Take her to a rehab center." Margaret nodded slowly. "I know." But something unspoken passed between them. A silent understanding. Letting go wouldn't be easy. The mother bear had entrusted them with this life, and neither of them was sure if they were ready to let someone else take over. A knock sounded at the door. Margaret wiped her eyes, steadied herself, and reached for the handle. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same for the Holden family again. The wind carried a quiet stillness over the Holden family's cabin, as if nature itself paused in reverence for what had just transpired. The great mother bear lay still now, her journey over. Yet something lingered in the air, a presence, a weight of unspoken gratitude. And then something unexpected happened. Little Lily, oblivious to the finality of death, but deeply aware of emotion, wiggled free from Margaret's arms and toddled toward the bear's massive head. Thomas moved instinctively to stop her, but something held him back. A feeling, a whisper of understanding between man and beast. Lily placed her small hand on the bear's snout, her voice a gentle whisper. "Sleep, Mama Bear, sleep." The solemn silence was broken only by the distant rumble of approaching vehicles. The headlights of Dr. Reyes' truck cut through the darkness, followed by the sweeping beams of the ranger station's vehicles. Dr. Reyes climbed out first, medical supplies in hand. But as she took in the scene before her, a grieving family, a motionless bear, a fragile cub wrapped in Margaret's arms, she froze. "What happened here?" she asked softly, stepping forward cautiously. Margaret wiped away her tears. "Something miraculous." Dr. Reyes knelt beside the cub, her experienced hands assessing its fragile body. "He's malnourished and dehydrated, but he should survive with proper care," she announced. Her tone, though professional, carried a note of warmth. Then she turned her attention to the mother bear, touching her gently before shaking her head. "She's been wounded for at least a week, Probably a poacher's trap or bullet. It's amazing she made it this far." "She was keeping her baby alive," Thomas said, his voice tight. "And she brought him here. But why us?" Dr. Reyes glanced up thoughtfully. "Bears have an incredible memory. Is it possible you've helped her before?" Margaret gasped, the memory rushing back. "Last spring, Thomas, remember? That bear caught in the old fence on the North Trail. We freed her." Thomas' eyes widened in realization. "You think this is the same bear? That was miles from here." Dr. Reyes nodded. "Bears remember kindness. When she was dying and had nowhere else to go, she brought her cub to the only humans she knew she could trust." As the weight of that realization settled, 2 ranger vehicles pulled into the yard. The officers approached cautiously, taking in the unusual sight. After a brief explanation, they set about the somber task of preparing to remove the mother bear's body. "What happens to the cub?" Thomas asked, watching as Dr. Reyes continued her careful examination. "The usual process would be to take him to a rehabilitation center," a ranger explained. "But he's so young, he'll need specialized care." Before anyone could respond, Lily's small voice rang out with certainty. "Baby, stay." The adults exchanged uncertain glances. How could they explain to a toddler that a wild bear cub couldn't simply live in their home? But Dr. Reyes tilted her head thoughtfully. "Actually, there might be a way," she said slowly. "A new wildlife rehabilitation program just started about 10 miles from here. They need local properties to serve as monitored release sites, places where young animals can be gradually reintroduced to the wild with supervision." Margaret and Thomas turned to each other, the weight of possibility sinking in. "You mean, after he's stable, he could be released here?" Margaret asked. Dr. Reyes nodded. "Exactly. Your land is already part of his mother's territory. He'd have the best chance of survival here." Thomas exhaled. "So we'd help raise him until he was ready to go." "Not quite raise," Dr. Reyes clarified. As the adults discussed logistics, Lily had already decided. She sat beside the cub, stroking his soft fur gently. The tiny bear let out a weak sigh, nuzzling deeper into the blanket. "Baby, not cry," Lily whispered. "Lily, Lily, help." Mama and Dada help. And just like that, the decision was made. The following morning, the Holdens drove to the rehabilitation center. Nestled between towering pines, the facility was modest yet well-equipped, dedicated to giving orphaned wildlife a second chance. Dr. Reyes met them at the entrance, smiling warmly as she spotted Lily. "Our little bear whisperer?" she greeted. "Come on. Hope's been waiting for you." Margaret blinked. "Hope?" Dr. Reyes gestured toward a small enclosure where the cub lay curled up beneath a heat lamp. "We had to call him something, and after what his mother did, it seemed fitting." Lily pressed her hands against the glass, eyes wide with wonder. "Hope," she repeated, nodding approvingly. "He's been given fluids and special formula," Dr. Reyes explained, her voice tinged with concern. "The next 72 hours will be critical." Margaret swallowed hard. "Will he make it?" Dr. Reyes sighed. "Bears are strong, but he's been through so much. His mother kept him alive at the cost of her own strength. If he has even half of her will to survive, we have a chance." They stayed for hours, watching over Hope as he slept, listening to his soft breaths. When it was time to leave, Lily refused at first, pressing her forehead against the glass. "Sleep, baby bear, sleep." Thomas knelt beside her, lifting her into his arms. "We'll come back," he promised, "and one day we'll bring him home." As they drove back to the cabin, the weight of responsibility settled over them. They weren't just caring for a cub, they were honoring a mother's final act of love. And in doing so, they had become something more than a family living in the wilderness. They had become a sanctuary. Months later, when the time came for Hope's release, Thomas and Margaret stood at the edge of their land, watching as the now healthy cub took his first steps into the wild. He paused for a moment, turning back, his dark eyes locking onto theirs. There was something there, recognition, perhaps gratitude. And then, just like his mother before him, he disappeared into the trees. Margaret took Thomas' hand, squeezing it tightly. "She trusted us," she whispered. "And we did right by her." From the porch, Lily waved toward the forest. "Bye-bye, baby bear," she called. "See you later." Thomas smiled. "Yeah, kiddo. We'll see him again." And somehow, they knew it was true. The first snowfall of winter came earlier than expected, blanketing the rugged landscape around the Holden family's cabin in a thick layer of white. Margaret Holden watched from the window as their once lush surroundings transformed into a quiet, frozen world. Somewhere beyond the trees, she knew Hope was nestled in his artificial den, following instincts he should have learned from his mother. The thought made her chest tighten with both pride and sorrow. A few months had passed since Hope had been introduced to the monitored release site on their property. Thomas had built the den with the help of the wildlife rehabilitation team, carefully crafting a space where the young bear could safely hibernate. But this winter felt different. The cabin, once filled with the constant hum of wildlife visitors and researchers, had grown still. Even their daughter, Lily, sensed the change. "Hope's sleeping now, just like Mama Bear taught him," Lily would say, peering at the latest footage from the remote cameras. Margaret and Thomas had told her that Hope's mother was watching over him from the stars. A simple, yet powerful explanation for a child so deeply connected to the bear's story. As much as they had prepared for this phase, Margaret found herself missing the daily updates on Hope's progress. At first, she and Thomas had visited the enclosure frequently, ensuring the cub was adjusting well. But as time went on, Hope's behavior had changed. He no longer ambled toward them when they arrived. Instead, he lingered at the far end of the enclosure, his dark eyes watching them from a distance. It was a painful yet necessary transformation. Hope was no longer the helpless cub they had rescued. He was becoming a bear. "It's what's supposed to happen," Thomas had reminded Margaret gently one evening as they sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the cold. This is what his mother wanted. Margaret knew he was right, but it didn't make it any easier. Hope was growing into his own wild self, and soon he would be ready for complete independence. The very idea filled her with both joy and fear. By late February, the snow had thickened, making trips to the monitored release site less frequent. But something had changed in the woods surrounding their home. Tracks, large, unfamiliar ones, had begun appearing near the tree line. At first, they thought it might be another bear passing through. But then the motion sensor cameras picked up a different image. A dark, hulking figure prowled the edge of the enclosure at night, eyes glinting eerily in the low light. Wolves. Thomas clenched his jaw as he reviewed the footage. That's too close. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. The last thing Hope needed was a pack of wolves testing his boundaries. He was strong, but he was still young, still learning, and without his mother to guide him, he would be at a disadvantage if challenged. "I don't like this," Margaret murmured. "What if they try to get into the enclosure?" "We'll reinforce the perimeter," Thomas said, already pulling on his coat. "If they're looking for food, we need to make sure Hope isn't it." The next morning they ventured out into the snow-covered forest, careful to remain quiet as they checked the enclosure. Hope had been spotted once on the cameras, but he remained unseen today. The tracks near the perimeter were fresh, too fresh. Margaret's heart pounded as she examined them. Then, something shifted in the air. A low growl, barely audible over the whispering wind, sent a shiver down her spine. She turned sharply, her breath catching as a pair of yellow eyes peered at her from the underbrush. A wolf, larger than any she had ever seen, stood watching. It didn't snarl or move toward them, but the message was clear. They were being observed. Thomas moved slowly, gripping the rifle slung over his shoulder, though they both knew firing was a last resort. "We're not here for a fight," he muttered. The wolf held its ground for another long moment before slipping back into the shadows of the forest. Margaret exhaled sharply, her pulse still racing. "This isn't over," Thomas said grimly. "They'll be back." They doubled their efforts, reinforcing the enclosure and making sure Hope had everything he needed. But as the days passed, the wolves grew bolder. They were testing boundaries, moving closer, lingering longer. And then, one night, the cameras caught something unexpected. Hope was awake. Not only awake, but standing at the edge of his enclosure, watching the wolves. The young bear, once small and helpless, now stood tall on powerful legs, his dark coat thick and gleaming in the moonlight. And when the wolves crept too close, Hope did something remarkable. He let out a deep, resonant growl. It wasn't the weak cry of a cub. It was the warning of a bear who had found his strength. The wolves hesitated, ears twitching, and then, one by one, they retreated into the trees. Hope remained still for a long moment before turning back toward his den, disappearing from view. Margaret and Thomas watched the footage in stunned silence. "He's ready," Thomas finally said, his voice filled with something close to awe. Margaret felt a lump rise in her throat. "Yes, he is." Spring arrived with the promise of change. Hope would soon be given full freedom, released without the safety net of human observation. It was time to let him go. On the morning of his release, the family stood at the edge of the enclosure, the gate open wide. Hope lingered just beyond it, his gaze meeting Margaret's for one brief, powerful moment. Then, without hesitation, he turned and walked into the forest. Lily, now old enough to understand what was happening, waved at his retreating form. "Goodbye, Hope," she said softly. "Mama Bear's watching you." Margaret swallowed back tears, squeezing Thomas's hand as they watched Hope disappear into the wild, where he truly belonged. He never looked back. And that was exactly how it should be. A legacy of hope, the bond that transcended time. A cool autumn breeze carried the scent of pine through the valley, rustling golden leaves as they drifted down from the towering trees. The Holden family's porch, once just a quiet retreat, had become a place of reflection, a threshold between the past and the future. On that particular evening, as the sky blushed with the last hues of sunset, Thomas Holden found his daughter, Lily, sitting on the wooden steps, staring into the shadowed forest. He sat beside her, the old boards creaking softly beneath his weight. "What's on your mind, sweetheart?" he asked, watching her profile, so much older now, yet still carrying that same spark of wonder she'd had as a child. Lily's lips pressed together in quiet thought. "I was wondering if Hope's cubs have names," she finally said, turning toward him with eyes that reflected both curiosity and something deeper, something wistful. Thomas felt his heart squeeze at her words. Hope, the orphaned cub that had once fit in the crook of his arms, trembling and frail, was now a mother herself. He had never stopped wondering about her, about whether she remembered the humans who had once saved her life, about the legacy left by the mother who had trusted them enough to bring her child to their doorstep. "What names would you give them?" he asked gently. Lily didn't hesitate. "Trust and promise," he said, her voice steady. "Because Hope's mama trusted us, and because she made us a promise without words." Thomas felt an unexpected lump rise in his throat. He had spent years trying to put words to what had happened that fateful night so long ago. But his daughter, who had barely been more than a baby herself when it all began, had captured it in just two simple names. "They're perfect," he murmured, squeezing her hand. Later that night, as Margaret tucked Lily into bed, the girl turned to her mother with another question, one that made Margaret pause. "Do you think someday trust and promise will bring their babies here too? Will they remember us?" Margaret smoothed her daughter's hair, her heart aching at the purity of the thought. She wanted to tell her daughter yes, to promise her that the cycle would continue, that the bond they had forged with Hope's mother all those years ago would never fade. But she also knew that wild creatures belonged to the wild, that the truest success of what they had done was that hope no longer needed them. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said softly, "but I do know that some connections stay with us, even when we can't see them anymore." Lily considered this, then nodded, like Hope's mama. "She's still watching, even if we can't see her." Margaret smiled, pressing a kiss to her daughter's forehead. Exactly like that. Years of change, a lifetime of impact. Time moved forward, but the Holden family never forgot the bear who had forever changed their lives. What had once been a quiet home at the edge of the wilderness had transformed into something much larger. Something that rippled far beyond their own family. Thomas's guided nature walks had grown into immersive conservation experiences, drawing visitors from across the country. Margaret's illustrations, first meant for Lily's bedtime stories, had turned into a best-selling children's book series, teaching young minds about wildlife conservation through the story of Hope and her family. The small rehabilitation effort had expanded, attracting researchers and biologists from around the world. Yet, through it all, their bond with Hope remained. Every now and then, in the hush of early morning or the quiet of dusk, Thomas or Margaret would catch a glimpse of a powerful figure moving between the trees. A bear, large and strong, her golden-brown fur illuminated by the slanting sunlight. Sometimes they'd see her alone, other times with cubs trailing behind. But she never lingered too long, never ventured too close. Hope had become what her mother had intended, a wild bear living freely. And yet, in those fleeting moments, they couldn't help but wonder. Did she remember? Did she still feel the pull of the place that had once been her refuge? Margaret often thought about that night, the way Hope's mother had collapsed at their doorstep, how she had looked at them with eyes full of trust and desperation, how she had somehow known that they would protect her child. "Do you think she knew?" Margaret asked one evening as she and Thomas stood together on the porch, gazing out into the forest. "Do you think she knew what she was setting in motion?" Thomas took his time answering, staring at the darkened treetops swaying gently in the wind. "I think," he said slowly, "that she hoped." He turned to his wife, his voice warm with conviction. "And sometimes hope is enough to create miracles." A soft sound carried on the wind then. A low huff, the sound of a bear's breathy exhale. Whether it was the wind or something more, neither of them could say. But the message was clear. Life continues. Love endures. And trust, once given, never truly fades. Lily, now nearly grown, whispered the words that had become sacred in their family, a quiet tribute to the bear who had started it all. "Thank you, Mama Bear." And somewhere deep in the heart of the wild, it almost seemed as if the forest whispered back, 2 decades of hope. A legacy continues. 15 years later, the Harper Wildlife Sanctuary, once the Holden's family home, was bustling with activity. It was mid-October, and the crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves as visitors arrived in droves, eager to experience the place that had become legendary in conservation circles. Inside the main building, a new exhibit had just opened. 2 decades of hope, a legacy of conservation. Photos lined the walls. Images of a tiny orphaned cub curled in blankets, of Lily as a toddler pressing her hand to the bear's fur, of Thomas and Margaret standing together at the sanctuary's opening ceremony. There were newspaper clippings, video interviews, even a children's corner filled with Margaret's books. And at the center of it all, a single framed photograph, a mother bear lying at the foot of a porch, a child reaching out, a bond that had changed the world. Lily, now an adult and a rising wildlife conservationist in her own right, stood at the heart of the exhibit, watching visitors take in the story that had shaped her life. A little girl, no older than Lily had been that night, tugged at her father's sleeve. "Daddy," she asked, "do you think her babies will come here someday?" Lily smiled, kneeling so she was eye level with the child. "Maybe," she said softly. "And if they do, we'll be ready." Outside, in the fading light, the forest waited, and somewhere, unseen, the legacy of trust and promise lived on. The legacy comes full circle. The crisp autumn air carried a gentle rustle through the golden treetops as visitors moved excitedly through the Harper Wildlife Sanctuary. The 2 Decades of Hope exhibition had drawn conservationists, scientists, and wildlife enthusiasts from all over the country, but amidst the bustling crowd, one young woman stood at the entrance, radiating warmth and quiet confidence. Dr. Lily Harper, now 22nd, had recently earned her doctorate in veterinary medicine, specializing in wildlife rehabilitation. The sanctuary's legacy had shaped her life, but she had never imagined how deeply its roots would spread. She turned, her eyes lighting up at the sight of a familiar figure making her way through the crowd. "Dr. Reyes," Lily called out, weaving through the visitors to embrace the older woman. Though in her 70s now, Dr. Elena Reyes still carried the same fierce energy that had once led the region's premier wildlife rescue efforts. She smiled fondly at Lily, stepping back to study her former protégé with pride. "Or should I say, Dr. Harper now," Reyes teased. "Your parents must be bursting with pride." Lily laughed. "They are. Speaking of which, they're waiting for us in the special collections room. There's something they want to show you before the official opening." They made their way through the exhibition hall, passing interactive displays on forest ecology, breathtaking photographs of black bears, and a dramatic timeline of the sanctuary's transformation from a single family's act of compassion into a nationally recognized conservation center. At the heart of the exhibit stood the life-sized bronze sculpture of a mother bear with her cub, a tribute commissioned for the 10th anniversary. It was a memorial to the bear that had started it all, the mother who had placed her last hope in the hands of humans. Beyond the main hall, in a quiet private room, Thomas and Margaret Holden waited. Though now in their 50s, their presence still carried the same warmth and passion that had defined them 2 decades earlier. Margaret's once small illustration projects had become a renowned nature book series, and Thomas had grown into one of the country's leading voices in community-driven wildlife conservation. "Elena!" Margaret exclaimed as Dr. Reyes stepped inside. "We're so glad you could make it." Daniel gestured toward a large topographical map mounted on the wall, layered with intricate tracking data overlaid in bright, shifting colors. "This," he said, his voice tinged with both awe and excitement, "is the cumulative territorial range of what we now believe to be 3 generations of Hope's descendants." Dr. Reyes stepped closer, adjusting her glass. The colored trails traced intricate movements across valleys and ridges, spanning miles of protected wilderness. "Incredible," she murmured. "And you've confirmed the genetic lineage," Thomas nodded. "The university's research team has been collecting fur samples for DNA analysis. So far, we've identified 11 bears, all direct descendants of Hope, including 4 cubs born just this past spring." Dr. Reyes exhaled softly. 11 bears, she repeated. All because one dying mother trusted humans with her cub. She turned to Lily, her expression both amazed and deeply moved. "And how many people have been influenced by this story?" Lily smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "We welcomed our 1 millionth visitor last month," she said. "And that doesn't even count the thousands of schools using our curriculum or the documentaries, books, and conservation programs inspired by the sanctuary." "The ripple effect," Margaret said quietly, using the phrase that had become a motto within their work. Thomas pointed to another section of the map. "The original site where Hope was released. Our old property. It's now the heart of a protected wildlife corridor spanning nearly 30 miles, linking 3 national forests. It's given safe passage not just to bears, but wolves, mountain lions, and elk, species that were once on the brink in this region." Before Dr. Reyes could respond, there was a soft knock at the door. A young staff member entered, breathless with excitement. "Dr. Harper," she blurted. "You asked to be notified immediately if there was any activity on the North Ridge camera." Lily straightened, heart pounding. "Yes. What have you seen?" The staff member's eyes gleamed. "It's her, the female we've been tracking. We believe she's Hope's granddaughter." A charged silence filled the room, and Thomas prompted, "Is she just passing through, or—" The staff member shook her head. "That's just it, Dr. Harper. She's not just passing through. She's lingering, and she has 2 cubs with her." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. "At the North Ridge?" Lily's pulse thundered. The North Ridge. The exact place where Hope's mother had collapsed all those years ago. The weight of the moment settled over them all like a hush before a storm. Dr. Reyes let out a slow, measured breath. "She's bringing them back." Lily turned to the screen as the images loaded. A powerful female bear stood at the edge of the ridge, gazing toward the valley below. 2 small figures nestled beside her. If you're still watching this story, drop a "own" in the comments to let us know you're here. The significance of it crashed into Lily like a tidal wave. She wasn't just wandering through the protected corridor. She was introducing her cubs to it. She was showing them home. A lump formed in Lily's throat. "Maybe," she whispered, "she remembers." Margaret, still staring at the screen, reached for Thomas's hand. "Do you think she knows," she asked softly, "that this all started because of her great-grandmother?" Thomas swallowed hard, his voice thick with emotion. "I think," he said, "that just like her ancestor, she trusts." Outside, the wind stirred the autumn leaves, carrying with it the echoes of a story that had begun 2 decades earlier. A mother bear had once brought her cub to humans in a desperate act of faith. Now her great-granddaughter had returned, not in desperation but in recognition. A new generation stood at the threshold, and the legacy of trust continued. The circle of trust. The room fell into an eerie silence as the implications settled over them. Hope's descendants weren't merely passing through. They had lingered at the North Ridge for over an hour, sitting quietly, their gaze fixed on the valley where the original Harper cabin had once stood. 3 generations later, these bears still maintained an inexplicable connection to the place where their ancestral line had nearly ended, and then been saved by an extraordinary moment of trust between species. "Would you like to see the footage?" the staff member asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas, Margaret, Lily, and Dr. Reyes exchanged glances. A strange energy filled the room. Curiosity, reverence, something just beyond explanation. "Yes," Lily said finally. "Show us." The high-definition footage flickered onto the screen. There, in crisp clarity, was the black bear mother, strong and healthy, with 2 cubs nestled close beside her. The way she sat, unmoving, simply staring out over the land, was unusual for this time of year. Bears should have been actively foraging, preparing for winter. But this one, she was watching, remembering. "It's October 18th, Margaret whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Exactly 20 years to the day since Hope's mother came to our door." A shiver ran down Thomas's spine. Dr. Reyes, the scientist who had once hesitated to attribute too much meaning to animal behavior, placed a gentle hand on Margaret's shoulder. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the evidence speaks for itself." As they continued watching, the mother bear finally stood, nudging her cubs with a tender insistence. They rose, stretching their small limbs before following her into the dense trees. Then, just before she vanished into the wilderness, the mother bear paused. For one lingering moment, she turned her head back, toward the camera, toward the ridge, toward the place where it had all begun. And then, just like that, she was gone. A legacy set in motion later that evening as twilight draped itself over the sanctuary. The Holden family stood together on the observation deck overlooking the valley. Behind them, the education center buzzed with activity as visitors explored the anniversary exhibition. Before them stretched thousands of acres of protected wilderness, a living legacy born from one desperate moment of trust. Lily, now standing at the threshold of her own future, broke the silence. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, "what would have happened if we hadn't been home that night? If Hope's mother had chosen another cabin? Or if you had been away in town?" Margaret shook her head slowly. "I don't think it was random." "You think she knew?" Lily asked, her voice filled with quiet wonder. Thomas folded his arms, gazing out over the darkening trees. "Maybe it was the bear we helped before," he suggested, referring to the theory they had long held, the idea that Hope's mother had remembered them from a past encounter, remembered their kindness. "Maybe," Margaret agreed. "Or maybe it was something more. Something we still don't fully understand about how deeply connected all living things truly are." They stood there for a long while as the stars began to shimmer above them. Somewhere in the wilderness, Hope's great-granddaughter and her cubs were settling in for the night, unknowingly continuing a story that had begun decades before. And though the Holdens knew they could never own such a story, they were part of it. Stewards, not just of land, but of a sacred trust. A whisper in the darkness just as they turned to leave. Lily paused. Something in the air, something she couldn't quite name, held her still. She turned back toward the forest, her gaze searching the shadows between the trees. Then she whispered it. The words that had become almost a prayer in their family. "Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to the mother bear who had died saving her cub. Thank you to Hope, who had survived and thrived. Thank you to the unseen forces that had led them all here, woven together in one desperate, beautiful moment of trust." A beat of silence. And then, from deep within the forest came the distant, low huff of a bear. Perhaps coincidence, perhaps acknowledgement. The Holdens smiled, not needing an answer. Some connections, they had learned, transcended time, species, even life itself. The final preparation as another summer approached. The sanctuary prepared for the final phase of Hope's grandson's release. Over the past year, the young bear, now affectionately named Echo, had been living in an expanded enclosure designed to simulate life in the wild. "We've hidden food in more challenging places," Dr. Reyes explained. "Introduce sounds of predators. We need to be sure he'll know how to survive without human intervention." For the Holdens, their role had shifted as well. They were now observers, not caretakers. Echo had to unlearn human familiarity, and that meant maintaining distance. It was difficult, especially for Lily. The bond she had formed with Hope as a child was not something she could replicate, nor should she. This was different. This was letting go. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that history was circling back. She watched Echo from a distance, watched him grow, learn, become wild. She thought about the mother bear who had come to them for help so many years ago. Had she known, truly known, that she was setting this into motion? That the tiny cub she had left behind would one day father generations? Or had she simply hoped? Lily swallowed hard, watching as Echo sniffed the air, his muscles coiling with the restless energy of youth. He was ready. He belonged to the wild now. Tomorrow, the gates would open. Tomorrow, he would walk free. And when he did, she hoped, with everything in her heart, that he would remember this place not as captivity, but as home. That when he had cubs of his own, they too would find their way back. That someday, years from now, another young woman would stand where she stood now, watching the children of Hope's lineage return, watching them gaze out at this land, at this valley, at this legacy, and they would know. They would know. Because trust, when given freely, never truly fades. It ripples outward, through time, through blood, through the quiet whispers of a forest that remembers everything. The final goodbye Hope's time had come. For 6 months, he had transformed from a fragile, malnourished cub into a strong, confident young bear, preparing for his return to the wild. The rehabilitation team had done everything possible to equip him with the skills he needed, teaching him to forage, to recognize danger, to survive without human assistance. But one question remained unspoken, lingering in the air like a final note of a song about to end. Would he remember? The Harper family had watched from a distance, knowing this moment was inevitable. but nothing could truly prepare them for the reality of letting him go. Margaret stood at the kitchen window that morning, watching the mist rise from the valley, a quiet ache settling in her chest. "I never thought I'd feel this way about a wild bear," she admitted to Thomas the night before. "It's like sending a child off to college. I'm proud and terrified all at once." Thomas had smiled, squeezing her hand. "I know," he had said, "but Hope has everything he needs now. He'll still be in these mountains, just living the life he was meant for." It should have been reassuring, but this wasn't just any bear. Hope had been left in their care, the last act of a mother who had trusted them with her baby. He had become part of their story in a way they never expected. And now it was time to say goodbye. A gathering of hearts, the Harper property buzzed with quiet activity as the small group of people who had shaped Hope's journey arrived. Dr. Reyes and the rehabilitation team moved with steady efficiency, checking last-minute details. Dr. Harrison reviewed the tracking equipment that would monitor Hope in his first months of freedom. Sophia, the filmmaker, adjusted her camera discreetly, knowing this was a moment that needed to be captured. On the porch, Margaret spotted their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Avery, watching from a distance. "All because a bear chose our doorstep," Margaret murmured, shaking her head in disbelief. Mrs. Avery gave a knowing nod. "Life's biggest changes often come from unexpected places," she said. "My Harold always told me, nature has a way of finding the right people when they're needed." Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat. Were they the right people? Had they done enough? In the middle of it all, Lily sat alone, on the porch steps, arranging and rearranging her collection of tiny bear figurines, her small hands tracing their shapes. Thomas noticed her quietness and sat beside her. "Are you thinking about tomorrow, sweetheart?" Lily nodded, her eyes downcast. "Hope won't be in his special place anymore." "That's right," Thomas said gently. "He'll be in the whole forest." Lily hesitated. Would he be scared? Thomas took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Maybe a little. New things can be scary. But he's ready. And he'll remember everything he's learned." For the first time, she looked up at her father, eyes full of unspoken fear. "Will he remember us?" The question hit him harder than he expected. He had no real answer. "I think," he said after a long pause, "he'll remember feeling safe here, just like his mother remembered." Lily seemed to accept that. She picked up the smallest bear figurine and placed it in her father's hands. "This is Hope when he was little," she whispered. "We should keep it, so we don't forget." The release dawn broke clear and golden over the valley, painting the land in soft light. By mid-morning, the transport vehicle arrived, carrying Hope in a specially designed crate. Through the viewing panels, they could see him. Strong, alert, restless, his body tensed, muscles rippling with the undeniable instinct to run. Dr. Reyes called the small group together, her voice calm yet firm. "This is it," she said. "We've done everything possible to prepare Hope. The moment we open the gate, he decides. If he hesitates, we let him take his time. If he bolts, we don't interfere. This is his choice." The air felt thick with anticipation. No one spoke. Thomas held Margaret's hand. Margaret held Lily's. Lily held her breath. The gate was unlatched, and for a single heartbeat, nothing happened. Hope paused, his dark eyes flicking over the people who had cared for him. Then he lifted his nose to the wind, breathing in the scent of the trees, the river, the world beyond the walls that had kept him safe. A shift in his body, a moment of stillness. Then he ran. Not hesitating, not looking back, just running. Lily gasped, watching his powerful body vanish into the thick forest, swallowed whole by the wilderness that had always been his home. For a long time, no one moved. Then Lily whispered, so softly that only those closest to her could hear, "Goodbye, Hope." The echo of a roar that evening, as the sky deepened into twilight, the Harper family sat on the porch in silence, their hearts still full from the day's events. "Do you think he'll ever come back?" Lily asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret smiled, stroking her daughter's hair. "I think he'll remember us, just in a different way." They sat in quiet reflection, gazing out into the darkened woods. Then, from somewhere deep in the valley, a sound rose through the trees. A distant, unmistakable roar. Margaret's breath caught. Thomas stiffened. And Lily's face lit up. "That was him," she whispered, clutching the tiny bear figurine still in her hand. "He's saying thank you." A tear slipped down Margaret's cheek. "Maybe," she said softly, "or maybe she wants us to know help." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the echoes of the past into the vastness of the night. And somewhere in the heart of the wild, hope lived on. The goodbye that changed everything. The day had finally come. Hope, once a helpless cub, brought to them in the final act of a dying mother's love, was ready to return to the wild. The transition had been months in the making, carefully planned by the rehabilitation team. Every decision, the location, the season, even the time of day, was made with one goal in mind: ensuring Hope's survival. The Harpers knew this moment was inevitable. They had been preparing for it, reminding themselves over and over that this was right, that Hope belonged in the wild. But now, as the final steps unfolded, Margaret felt the weight of it pressing against her chest. Would he survive? Would he remember them? Or, perhaps most painful of all, would he forget? The walk to freedom. The release team carried Hope's transport crate on a special stretcher, moving carefully through the dense forest. Thomas and Margaret walked behind them, hands clasped tightly together. Lily, now just over 2 years old, trotted between them, unusually quiet, her tiny fingers clinging to Margaret's jacket. Even the forest seemed to hold its breath. When they reached the designated clearing, the team positioned the crate facing into the deeper wilderness. Dr. Reyes, who had overseen Hope's care since the very beginning, performed one final check of his tracking collar, then turned to the family. "This is it," she said softly. Margaret felt her throat tighten. From now on, Hope would be on his own. No more visits, no more updates. Dr. Reyes met their eyes, sensing their unspoken emotions. "I know this is hard," she said gently, "but remember, the greatest gift you can give him now is his freedom." Lily tugged on her mother's sleeve, her voice clear and solemn in the hushed stillness. "Hope, go home now, like Mama Bear wanted." Margaret's heart clenched. How did she always seem to know exactly what to say? Dr. Reyes gave a final nod. "We're ready." Hope's first steps into the wild. The crate was unlatched. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a slow, deliberate shift inside. The sound of deep breathing. The scrape of claws against wood. The door swung open. Hope hesitated. He sniffed the air, his nose lifting to the wind, taking in the scent of the forest, his forest. He took one cautious step forward, then another. His dark eyes flicked toward the people who had cared for him. He didn't linger, but for one fleeting moment he looked at them, really looked at them, and then he ran. Through the underbrush, over fallen logs, moving with the effortless grace that was his birthright. A wild creature returning home. A wild creature returning home. Lily gasped, clutching her mother's hand. Margaret swallowed back tears. Then he was gone, vanished into the green. A quiet house, an empty forest that night. After the release team had packed up and gone, the Harper home felt unbearably quiet. Margaret tucked Lily into bed, brushing soft curls away from her daughter's face. Lily blinked sleepily. Mama Bear see Hope now? Margaret hesitated. She hadn't expected the question, but she should have. She found herself whispering, "Yes, sweetheart. She knows he's safe, just like she wanted." Lily nodded, satisfied. "She brought him to us Because we help." Margaret kissed her forehead, blinking against the sting in her eyes. "That's right," she murmured. She trusted us with something precious. Finding hope again. Days passed, then weeks, then months. They still received occasional tracking updates from Dr. Reyes, but there were no more visits, no more glimpses of hope wandering near their property. The absence was strange. A part of their world had shifted, leaving behind an emptiness they didn't quite know how to fill. For Lily, the transition was especially difficult. Too young to fully understand, she still spent long moments staring out the window, waiting, watching. To help her, Thomas and Margaret started a new tradition. Each night, before bed, they told Hope's great adventure, a story they built together, imagining Hope's life in the wild. Some details came from the real tracking data. Others were simply their hearts hoping. Today, Hope found a big blackberry patch. Thomas would begin, and he ate until his whole mouth turned purple. Lily would giggle, adding her own twist. Then he took a nap under an old pine tree. Margaret would continue, listening to the wind in the branches. These stories helped all of them, maintaining their connection while respecting the necessary distance. But still, Margaret couldn't help wondering, would they ever see him again? A new beginning. Seasons changed. Leaves turned gold, then fell. Snow blanketed the land, and the forest fell into winter's hush. And slowly, life at the Harper home transformed. With help from the wildlife experts, they converted an old outbuilding into a small nature center, where school groups could learn about black bears and conservation. Margaret's illustrations, inspired by Hope's story, became popular teaching materials. And Thomas, now fully certified in wildlife management, began leading guided nature walks, teaching others how to observe wildlife with respect and understand. Their lives had changed forever, because a mother bear had once chosen their doorstep. One last sign. One evening, nearly a year after Hope's release, Margaret stepped onto the porch, breathing in the crisp air. Something in the forest felt different. She turned her head, scanning the tree line, and then she saw him. A dark shape, nearly hidden by the shadows, standing just at the edge of the woods. Her breath caught. Hope. He had grown, so much bigger now, powerful and confident. But even in the dim light, she knew it was him. For a moment, he simply stood there, watching. Then, he did something that made Margaret's heart stop. He lifted his nose and huffed. A soft, familiar sound, the same sound his mother had made the night she collapsed in their yard. Margaret clutched the railing, tears welling in her eyes. Then, as silently as he had appeared, Hope turned and disappeared back into the trees. She stood there, the night wind cool on her face, her heart full. He had not forgotten. Somewhere behind her, the door creaked open. Lily's small voice broke the silence. "Mama, what are you looking at?" Margaret wiped her eyes, smiling as she turned back. "Just Hope," she whispered. "Did he come home?" Margaret pulled her daughter close, kissing her hair. He never really left. The homecoming no one expected. 18 months after Hope's release into the wild, a documentary chronicling her journey aired, capturing hearts around the world. It was more than just a wildlife story. It was a testament to resilience, trust, and the extraordinary bond that had formed between a grieving mother bear and the family she chose in her final moments. The documentary's success brought even more attention to the Harpers' conservation efforts. Through it all, they received updates from the wildlife tracking team. Hope was thriving. Her movements, recorded through GPS data, showed a young bear establishing her own territory, foraging successfully, and avoiding human contact. A crucial sign that she was adapting exactly as she should. Then, as winter approached for the second time, Dr. Harrison delivered news that made Margaret's breath catch. "Hope has built a proper den," he announced. Just as her mother would have taught her, the words were meant to reassure, and they did. But they also carried a weight of sadness. The memory of that night, when a dying mother bear had struggled to their doorstep, trusting strangers with her most precious gift, was never far from their minds. The silence that followed seasons changed. The tracking reports became less frequent, first monthly, then quarterly, then twice a year. By design, Hope was meant to live fully wild, free of human intervention. The GPS collar that had monitored her movements was programmed to detach when the time was right. Eventually, it did. And just like that, Hope vanished from their maps. At first, Margaret found herself waking up in the middle of the night, wondering if Hope was safe, if she had survived the harsh winters, if she still roamed the mountains near their home. Lily, now in kindergarten, adapted in her own way. Though she had other interests, stories, drawing, and an endless curiosity about the world, bears remained her greatest fascination. On weekends, she often accompanied Thomas on his guided nature walks, telling visitors in a solemn voice, "We have to be quiet and stay far away, so we don't bother the animals in their homes." She never wavered in what she wanted to be when she grew up. An animal doctor, like Dr. Reyes. A ghost in the forest 3 years after Hope's release. An unexpected call from Dr. Harrison changed everything. "We have something for you," he said. "We think it's Hope." A camera trap had captured images of a healthy adult bear, strong, thick-furred, unmistakably thriving. Though her collar had detached, her distinctive chest markings left little doubt. "She's right where she should be," Dr. Harrison said. "And she's doing everything right." Margaret stared at the photo, tears pricking her eyes. Hope had made it. She was alive. She was alive. She was exactly who she was meant to be. A birthday surprise. Life moved forward. The Harpers' conservation work expanded. Their small nature center grew, hosting school groups eager to learn about the legacy of the bear who had once been a helpless cub on their porch. Hope's story became local legend, passed from generation to generation, whispered around campfires, taught in classrooms, a testament to the delicate, powerful connection between humans and wild. Then, on Lily's 7th birthday, something extraordinary happened. The family had gathered in their backyard for a simple celebration. A picnic under the trees, laughter echoing in the warm summer air. Margaret was pouring lemonade when she froze, her hand tightening on the pitcher. Someone was standing at the edge of the forest. "Thomas," she whispered. "Look." He followed her gaze, his breath catching in his throat. 50 yards away, standing in the dappled light of the tree line, was a magnificent black bear. She was full-grown now, powerful and strong. Lily, catching sight of her, gasped, "Is that—" Margaret couldn't finish the question. Thomas lifted his binoculars, focusing on the bear's chest. The white markings were unmistakable. "It's her," he murmured. "Hope." But it wasn't just her. From the underbrush behind her, 2 tiny cubs tumbled into view. Lily clutched her mother's arm, eyes wide with wonder. "Hope has babies," she whispered. The family stood frozen, unable to speak, unable to believe what they were seeing. And then, Hope moved closer. Not aggressively, not fearfully. Deliberately. She wasn't just passing through. She had brought her cubs here. She had come back. Tears slipped silently down Margaret's cheeks. "She remembers," she whispered. Even after all this time, even after years in the wild, Hope had come home. For a long moment, the bear stood watching them, her dark eyes calm, knowing. Then, just as her mother had done so long ago, she nuzzled her cubs forward, gently guiding them back toward the safety of the trees. Before she disappeared, she turned one last time, her gaze landing directly on Lily. A silent message, a circle completed. Then, she was gone. The legacy lives on. That night after Lily had fallen asleep, Margaret and Thomas sat on the porch, the air warm and heavy with the scent of pine. Margaret's voice was quiet. "Do you think she meant to come back?" Thomas exhaled slowly, staring into the trees where Hope had vanished. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I think—" Some bonds never break. The next morning, they called Dr. Reyes and Dr. Harrison, bursting with the news. Dr. Harrison was amazed but cautious. Bears have remarkable memory, he said. And they do form associations with places tied to survival. It's possible she simply recognized the area as a safe space for her cubs. But Dr. Reyes, ever the scientist who had once believed in miracles, had a different take. I think, she said, that she brought them to show you. Margaret swallowed hard. Show us what? Dr. Reyes's voice was soft, full of certainty, that you were part of her story. And now, she's part of yours. Margaret looked out at the trees, knowing. Somewhere in the wild, Hope and her cubs were safe. Somewhere in the vast, whispering forest, the bond remained unbroken. And just as she had done for years, Margaret closed her eyes and whispered into the wind. Not goodbye, but gratitude. Thank you, Mama Bear. The breeze shifted through the trees. And for just a moment, just a heartbeat, it almost felt like the forest whispered back. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story moved you, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring stories of resilience, hope, and the unbreakable spirit of life. See you in the next story.